I'm with Apt Associates, and we're working with the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And as part of our work, we did a series of focus groups with people with disabilities. And we did 8 focus groups, and there were 2 population groups. The first ones were adults with disabilities receiving either SSDI or SSI who work or want to work. And the majority of the people actually in the focus group were on SSDI. So we only had a couple who had been on SSI and were continuing in. And then another focus groups were with parents and guardians of children receiving SSI and or Medicaid who are aging out of the school system. So it's kind of how the parents are doing financial planning. We did these focus groups in the state of Iowa and Wisconsin, and we ranged from large metropolitan cities, so we did some in Milwaukee, to medium-sized cities in Madison and Des Moines, and then at a regional state of Iowa center in Mason City, which brought in people from a number of rural areas in northern Iowa. The focus groups with the adults with disabilities, we had 26 participants. They ranged in age from 19 to their early 60s. The majority were white, they're mixed gendered, and they're primarily lower income people. The focus groups with the parents and guardians of children with disabilities, again, were in Wisconsin and Iowa. We had 25 participants, and they ranged in age from about 30 to the 60s. In Wisconsin, the focus groups were mixed race, and in Iowa, they were predominantly white. In Wisconsin, most of the participants were women, and in Iowa, mixed gender, and it was a real range of income. The other thing is that the majority of people, parents who participated in these focus groups, also mentioned that they had college degrees, so they're well educated, knew about financial planning and all of that. The core questions that we looked at in the 2 focus groups are, how do individuals and families plan for their financial future? What are people's attitudes about employment? How do people interact with their local school district to address their children's needs? How well do people understand SSA rules and regulations? And what sources of financial information do people find most useful? In general, the findings were in 5 specific areas. One of them, as we went through the discussion groups and we met with the Wiseman Center in Wisconsin, which hosted our focus groups there, and in Iowa, it was the Work Incentive and Planning Assistance Office that's part of the state. Just the very, very complex network of programs and agencies that people deal with. I mean, we've been talking, primarily around Social Security Administration, but we have people that are dealing with a lot of state agencies, local agencies, school districts, nonprofit organizations. So there's a real mix, and for both focus groups, and we've included this in the paper, we asked them to go through and just list all the agencies that, either a parent, a caregiver, or an adult with disabilities would typically be dealing with, and both of them are at least a page long. And as we went through the focus groups, we probably added like 10 or 20 more agencies. So as people are talking about all these people that they need to interact with, and they need to understand all the rules and regulations for each of these organizations too. So I mean, that was very critical and was kind of overwhelming to learn about. The other thing that we learned is that people are under considerable stress to address their current and future financial needs. Sadly enough, we had 2 people that ended up in tears as they were talking about this. I mean, one of them was a younger woman who said, listening to other people in the focus groups, I just didn't know that I was going to have this ahead of me. Kind of all these complications that she was hearing other people talking about. And another one was a parent who, said everything in their family had been focused on their child with disabilities, but they had 2 other children that were getting ready to go to college, and they found out the source of funds that they were going to use to send those kids to college were no longer available. So she said, every day as a parent, she feels like she's let down her child with disabilities, but she said, now I'm also letting down my other children. So I mean, again, it's just a lot of stress and pressure that people have in their lives. The other thing, as Mary briefly mentioned, but was a big focus of all of our focus groups, was the vital importance of medical coverage. whether it's Medicare, Medicaid. In Iowa, they have a state buy-in Medicaid program for people who are starting out on SSDI. It just consumes people. I mean, we heard of people who have prescription costs of $5,000 a day, of 4 or 5-year-old children who have had 38 surgeries already. And, you know, a number of the people, particularly in Des Moines and in Madison, you know, people who worked for the state government or worked for the university, who had fairly good health coverage, you know, private insurance coverage, but they're mostly capped out, you know, around $1 million. And they said, you know, we're easily way over that. So, I mean, they need to depend on other resources. But it's just the financial ruin that would happen if anything goes wrong and they lose their coverage. The other one is the critical need for accurate information. And again, some of the things that came in the focus group were, you know, as I mentioned below, people have very favorable experiences working with the Social Security Administration. They really liked it that a live person answers the phone. They said it's one of the only agencies that they work with, you know, in the state or federal level, where when there's somebody there answering the phone. They may not always be happy with the information they're getting, but they usually get to talk to a live body. But the other thing that we saw is that even when people were getting information from Social Security, they were going back to these nonprofit organizations that they work with to validate whatever it was that Social Security was telling them. And one of the things that I think was of concern to us, that was another thread throughout this whole focus group, was that many of these people were either state agency employees or they were in a nonprofit organization that was funded by a state government, and those dollars are just diminishing. I mean, people are worried about their jobs all the time. And I mean, we were working with people who had been in their jobs for like 13 years, 15 years, 17 years. And I mean, that was really, they counted on that one individual person to validate any information that people gave them. So again, there was a concern that, you know, getting the right information to people. And we did have a couple of things where, you know, we had to go back and say, you know, that wasn't really correct, what somebody had told them. With the adults with disabilities, we looked at a couple of different issues. One was employment attitudes and behavior, kind of what people's current employment status was, what their employment barriers were, financial planning, their motivations, impediments, techniques, again, understanding the rules and regulations, and the financial education, their current sources of financial information and advice, and opinions about forms of financial education. In Iowa, it was a little bit different than Wisconsin. People there really wanted to be self-sufficient, and they really saw the only thing, you know, they felt that if they could keep working enough, they could be self-sufficient if they were allowed to earn more income and not have it counted them against them in any way. But they just wanted to be off government assistance. You know, they felt that that was a stigma. They felt that they were being penalized, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. They believe that they're managing their limited resources as best they can, but they believe they have significant impediments to savings and financial planning. They have very limited incomes. They're living, you know, day to day. They all said they had a budget, whether it was written down or it was in their mind. They knew exactly how much money they were getting in every month and how much they could spend. There were a couple of people, I mean, again, difficult times during a transition period for some of the people on SSDI while they were waiting, you know, for their eligibility to kick in. You know, they were depending on payday loans. They were cashing out 401k or other retirement programs. They were maximizing their credit cards. So, you know, by the time that they did start receiving SSDI, they were in a pretty bad financial position. Again, they don't want to do anything to jeopardize their SSDI, SSI, Medicaid, Medicare benefits. One of the things that we had talked about, too, was, you know, if people ever felt pressure to work under the table, work extra hours, and all of them said no. They said they kind of heard about stories about that. where, felt that they, people were being taken advantage of, but none of them had experienced that. But again, I mean, 1 hour, 2 hours, anything that would put them over, they didn't want to jeopardize that. And again, as I mentioned, overall people really want to work. One of the things, again, that they're very concerned about is the lack of vocational training. And again, this was another issue where vocational trainings were typically funded through state government, and they were being completely wiped out. In Wisconsin, we had a man whose daughter had signed up for vocational training when she was 14 years old. She was 20 years old. She just graduated from high school, and they said it was still probably another 2 years before she would be able to get into the program. So he was very concerned that she was in a very limited minimum wage job, and he didn't want her to settle for that. But he said, without her being able to go out and get extra vocational training, he wanted to break her of that mindset. The other thing that was interesting too, when people, they're concerned about reduction in pay and stature. We had 2 people who had been professionals, both of them actually accountants. And one of them worked at Walmart, and one of them worked at a local restaurant in Iowa. And I mean, for them it was, they really felt that they were taking a step back. I mean, they knew they couldn't, be accountants anymore. But it was just, as one of them said, I feel like I'm going back and I'm working with high school kids. The other thing that was very frustrating was that they felt that they couldn't accept bonuses or promotional raises. And one of them had talked about a situation he had worked at Walmart, started as a greeter, had a good work record, good rapport, and they wanted to promote him to an assistant manager, but to do so would raise his income, so he would, concerned that he was going to jeopardize some of his benefits. He had talked to the company to say, could I get the promotion without the extra salary? And they said, no, unfortunately, no, because, you've got rules across the country, and they said, we just can't kind of be making these one-on-one situations. Another one was very frustrated because he worked for a family-owned company in Iowa, and every year at Christmas they gave very large bonuses, $5,000 to $10,000. And he said he didn't feel that he could accept that, and they said they wanted to be rewarded for work well done. And they just felt that the way the situation was set up, they couldn't do that. So that, again, was something that was very frustrating to them. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the other finding was the reliance on community organizations to provide information about Social Security Administration. And again, I talk about community resources, but it actually would be like 1 or 2 individual people that they were very dependent on. It was Mary, Sheila, the people that were transcribing the tapes from the focus groups would always come back and say, this is who Mary is, this is who Sheila is, because you would be hearing these names over and over again. Like, yes, somebody told me that, or I got a letter, but I want them to look at it first. So, and again, people who are in these jobs are concerned, that what's going to happen if they're not in these jobs, and who are people going to go to. The other thing that we had found in like Milwaukee and Madison and Des Moines, that people also had like one-on-one contact with people from Social Security, whereas in Mason City everything was over the phone. And they really missed that. They wanted to see the person that was giving them the information, so that was kind of hard for them. In the parents and guardians of children with disabilities who are aging out of the school system, again, financial and estate planning for families was just an overwhelming concern. And their current source of information was mostly other parents, or when their children got into the school district, they were hearing about different, different ways, different avenues that were open to them. Again, kind of their motivations, impediments, techniques, wills and guardianship, special needs trust, and legal counsel. And oops, I think one of the big issues that we heard, and was very helpful to do this, both in a large metropolitan city and in rural communities, is that in the rural communities, people don't have like legal aid, they don't have pro bono legal assistance, it was very difficult to find an attorney that knew how to set up a special needs trust for a child, or to set up a guardianship, you know, for a young adult who the parents were going to maintain the guardianship for. And they said they didn't even know where to go to find some of these. The other thing was the involvement that people had with their school districts in addressing family needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about this because, I mean, people very, very heavily for the parents depend on their local school districts as being a source of information. And one of the things that we were able to talk about is, I mean, do the school districts really see themselves playing this role? And again, they're being impacted with budget cuts, and you know, a lot of the parents we talk to have kind of a very idealized version of what role they'd like to see the school districts play. And again, understanding the rules and regulations. Again, on the financial and estate planning, benefits and legal issues, we really saw that people were scrambling for information. One of the things, too, like when people came into the focus groups, they knew it was a focus group, but they were saying, well, I also wanted to come here and learn more information from other people. And it's like, well, that wasn't really our intent, but that's nice to see. I mean, the other thing that we would see is after the focus groups, particularly with the parents group, that they would still all be out in the parking lot talking to each other, many of whom haven't even met before, you know, as we're driving away, and they're thanking us for bringing people together because they don't have these opportunities. The special needs trust and legal guardianship, as I mentioned, a real concern about finding legal assistance. One of the things that we briefly looked at was to see if there were law schools that actually include this in their curriculum, and we couldn't find any that did. We understand the University of Nebraska's thinking about it, considering it, understand there's a need, but it's basically just viewed as a continuing legal education program. It's not built into the curriculum. The other thing that we had found, like with one of our parents in Iowa, that they had paid someone to set up a guardianship for their adult child, and it wasn't there. I mean, it was somebody that knew how to set up a guardianship, but it wasn't this type of guardianship for, you know, someone who is receiving Social Security benefits. Again, as I mentioned, the involvement with the local school district, and we heard from a couple parents that said until their child went to school, they kept thinking the child's going to be normal. They said they were just totally focused on medical issues, social issues, their family's issues, and they hadn't even really started thinking financial planning, estate planning, guardianship, and it's when they came together with other parents. The other thing that we saw is programs vary considerably by district, and we also heard people who specifically moved to, you know, bought a home in another school district so that they could be there, but also recognizing that they realize that's not an option that's open to lower income people or, you know, other people out in rural communities. One of the things that they cited was a school district in suburban Des Moines that every year they come out with the goals for the year, the superintendent does, where he reports to the community. And it's mandated by the school board that special needs be on that list. And you know, people were very surprised, but I mean, how that school district is going to deal with special needs, and then at the end of the year, he reports back on what he's doing with the different communities. The other one was just the limited resources that are available to school districts. They felt that the special needs teachers, you know, had a lot of training and were very understanding, but that in the general, you know, with the other teachers, there just wasn't the time or the effort to learn. And they also said they were kind of concerned that it kind of seems to be waves of focus on different types of disabilities with children. So they said for a while, school districts were very well versed in Down syndrome. Now they said it's autism. You know, and they said if your child has anything else, you're kind of missing on that. And again, kind of winding up here, the implications are, you know, on the financial education, I mean, we really saw that people had the knowledge, you know, they knew financial planning, but for the most part, they're living on very tight budgets. In both groups, very little nest egg or funds for emergencies, no extra funds. They just don't see that, you know, the difficulty in saving or building assets. Very concerned about how they're going to support other children in the family, again, college education, their own retirement. On benefits, there's some confusion about programs and resources. I mean, in some of the adult groups, we would say, are you an SSI, SSDI, Medicare, Medicaid? And they couldn't tell us. I mean, and in Iowa, one of the issues was that they do have the state buy-in, Medicaid buy-in program, so people were saying, well, I'm on Medicaid, but it's actually a state program. It wasn't federal Medicaid. In employment, again, strong interest in employment and increasing ability, and then again, the rules and regulations and understanding that. So again, we'll just kind of move through. Okay, well, thank you very much.